Hello, this is Douglas Lucky Larson on the Retire Early and Often channel, and today we are talking about the inflation monster that is coming for you and for me, and what you can do about it. If you're watching this, you've certainly heard about the official inflation number of about 7%, and you've also likely heard about the shadow stat numbers that estimate inflation at more like 15% per year. Some people hotly debate that 15% number, but inflation is a very personal thing. If you don't drive much and you grow a lot of your own food in your garden and you don't eat out much, and maybe if your housing costs are locked in, well, you might not feel inflation very much. Some families, though, with, say, two cars and several kids and lots of commuting and increased rent prices, might be feeling more like 25% inflation. You probably also know that inflation is not really the price or value of things going up, but instead the devaluing or the dilution of your currency and the lowering of the amount of goods and services that your currency notes can buy. It's likely that your parents or grandparents bought a modest starter home in, say, the 1950s for about $10,000 or $15,000. That same house today has a price tag of 300 or 500 grand or more, depending on where it is. But not because the house has changed. Really, it's about our devalued currency. Did you know that in 1955 the minimum wage was 75 cents and the average household income was about $4,000 per year? Per year. An average new car in 1955 was about $2,000. And you've got to see what that included back in the day. I love this ad. This is from Dale Chevrolet. And for 2,000 bucks, here's what you got. A Chevy Bel Air hardtop with dual sun visors. Ooh. And a deluxe steering wheel. How about foam rubber cushions? What is that compared to wooden benches? I don't know. Front and rear armrests, electric clock, ooh, ashtray, cigar lighter. Gotta love that. Chrome donut hubcaps, 2 gallons of antifreeze. Ooh. 12-volt electrical system as opposed to DC. Uh, a glove compartment. Yeah, big benefits there. And tubeless tires. Can you imagine? Those were the features. Now I know you're gonna laugh, but that was big stuff back in the day. So compared to the cars of the 20s and 30s, these are some awesome and nice features. That car restored to its original state right now, man, that could run you 25 to even up to 40 or 50 grand. Now, the average, let's say, ordinary car today, a sedan in 2022, it would certainly run you 30 to 35 grand. And that's not a luxury model. So keep that all in mind when we're talking about inflation or the devaluation of your currency. You see, our little green pieces of paper are being printed, or rather being borrowed into existence through a strange partnership between banks and the Treasury Department at a very alarming rate. The money supply has increased, and so long as the velocity or the turnover of that money continues, well, we get inflated prices, or rather deflated or diluted currency units. If you cut a pizza into smaller and smaller little pieces, you have a lot more pieces of pizza, but you only have the same total amount of pizza overall. Real economic changes, well, they're a little more complicated than just simply diluting the currency, and that's because of a lot of different factors, like globalization, international trade, and the dollar being the reserve currency. Let's not forget the petrodollar, which means that most countries in the world buy oil in US dollars. We've also been able to offset a lot of the inflation that we would have seen because of low wage immigrants doing a lot of our essential service labor, like in construction or restaurant work or maid service, etc. We've also benefited from automation and all kinds of technological advances that give us more and better products and services than our parents or grandparents had. The overall effect is a better life by many standards, and perhaps a more stressful and less healthy lifestyle as well. We have more stuff and way cooler cars, way more entertainment options, but we're fatter and less fulfilled generally than our grandparents were. Now, back to the inflation aspect. Many people point to the early 1970s when we were taken off the gold standard, meaning that the actual connection was removed between our green pieces of paper and their claim on physical gold or silver. Yes, most graphs and charts will show inflation increasing in that period, but all fiat currencies go down in value and almost always eventually fail. Let's take a look at this graph a little bit closer. I love this one. Um, if you go all the way back to 1900, that's about right here, and you look at where the currency was, between here and here, our currency has lost almost 98% of its purchasing power. That is amazing. Now, right about here is where we went off the gold standard, and you can see there's a precipitous decline. But between here and here, there certainly was a big decline in the purchasing power of the dollar. Now, in the last 2 years, we've seen some extra hot inflation in the US and certainly other parts of the world because of many factors. But I'll try to break it down with some very simple examples, and we can determine how sticky or persistent this so-called transitory inflation really is. Here's one example of the escalating inflation chain. My barely 15-year-old son got a job this past November working for McDonald's. All right? They were very pleased to hire an intelligent and intelligible young man who was willing to work Friday and Saturday evening shifts, taking orders on the headset at the drive-through window. They started him at $12 an hour. The 15-and-a-half-year-old young lady that trained him was making $14 an hour, and she had only worked there for 6 months. But she was the employee who had worked at the location the longest. A 15-and-a-half-year-old employee with seniority and doing the training. These are crazy times. So, although minimum wage is about $8 an hour in my state, McDonald's is paying 50 or 70% higher for warm bodies because they're pretty desperate. You've probably noticed, if you ever go to McDonald's, that the menu choices have diminished, especially for time-intensive and supply chain sensitive items like salads, for instance. Also, in order to pay the higher wages, there is no dollar menu, but instead the same exact items are like $1.30 or $1.50 or more. The combo meals are also a little higher by like 10 or 20%, and they don't have enough employees to staff both the drive-up window and the inside counter and keep the lobby and tables clean. So they only have the drive-up window. This means that we, the consumers, have fewer products and service options, but higher prices. Now, because employees are not likely to accept a pay cut anytime soon, and my son and probably others are already talking about potential pay increases by a couple dollars, once he's been there for a few more months, there's no way McDonald's can reduce meal prices. Wages are not the only input for the higher prices. Every component of a hamburger has gone up in price, from the fertilizer to grow the grain for the buns and to feed cattle, and then the beef itself, and the processing, and the fuel for machines and utilities and transportation costs, and the franchise location rent. Oh, and property insurance and taxes, and everything is all going up. Now, it's not likely that we will see all of these inputs change noticeably to the downside anytime soon in order to bring down a McDonald's combo meal. That all becomes sticky inflation. Now, I am also seeing much higher wages and materials with my real estate investing, from building supplies to delivery fees to subcontractor wages. And everybody knows that during 2020, 2021, a lot of those costs were going up. But trust me, they're sticking. They're not just coming back down. Lumber went up, came back down a little, then went right back up again. It's supply and demand, it's supply chain. There's a lot of factors in there, but my costs are going up. Add in higher taxes and insurance costs, and of course, I have to pass all those costs on in either a higher retail price when I sell or in monthly rents. If my costs don't go down and there are plenty of tenants to choose from, I will not be lowering rents. In order to pay those rents, my tenants are getting raises, or they're moving to cheaper areas and someone with higher wage is moving in. The employer who is paying those higher wages must raise their prices for the products or services they provide into the economy, and on it goes. Now, the government has interesting ways of measuring inflation, including their flawed version of calculating rent, but that's a whole nother video. Another thing to remember is that the government measures inflation year over year. So no doubt they will try to tell us later this year that inflation is easing, but it's still going to be 4 or 5 or whatever percent on top of the inflation that was already showing up last year. As always, the government and the Fed refuse to take any responsibility or blame for inflation, but the combination of expanded currency supply, artificially low interest rates, and easy borrowing always help create extra spending. You probably know that welfare or food stamps went up 25% last year. That's not that the total amount went up, it may have, but the amount of money that the government was giving out on the SNAP program, the food stamp program, went up by 25%. And Social Security went up 6% because the government acknowledged quietly that a cost of living increase was needed. Well, duh. We call that inflation. Stimulus checks and tax credits were mailed out all through the last half of 2020 and all of 2021. Billions of dollars were given out in the form of PPP loans and grants. That extra money in the system certainly got spent on food and fuel and housing, but also on assets like stocks and real estate and cryptocurrency speculation. With decent velocity in an economy, that money gets sloshed around and around, driving up prices and costs and wages wherever it goes. Many of the really smart people that I listen to believe that we are experiencing a K-shaped inflation. They always talked last year about K-shaped recovery. Some areas doing well, some, not so well. But K-shaped inflation is a similar kind of thing. It's where many of the products, the retail items and services that we buy are going up, way up, and many other things are flat or actually going down in price. It's likely that when all the ships that are stuck off the coast of California finally get unloaded and all those goods are distributed, that we will see some excess inventory. They say it's already starting to show up here in early February of 2022. That excess inventory of many products should bring some prices down, especially things like seasonal items like snow boots or jackets or other winter items that were supposed to be sold before Christmas, but simply didn't make it to the shelves. However, if fuel and shipping costs remain high, along with all other labor inputs as well as building materials, then home prices and interest rates and gasoline and rent will really bite. This is the real inflation that's felt by most people, even if the official numbers do not reflect it. So the government can say what they want if it makes them look better, but the average person had their rent go up by 10 or 20% in the last 18 months. Depending on where you live, of course, and some places it was more. If they shop at Dollar Tree, well, prices went up 25%. If they put gas in their car, that's gone up 50% or more. Health insurance has gone up 10 or 20% for most people. If they bought a house in the last 12 months, they paid 20% more than if they had bought in 2019. Now, I know we argue in other videos that it doesn't affect you the same if interest rates are down because your payment is about the same. But again, we're talking about inflation and costs. Okay, and in nominal costs, those things have all gone up. Fast food, from Happy Meals to sub sandwiches, have all gone up 10 or 20%. So that even though wages have picked up by a little bit, they say maybe 5 to 7% on average, well, purchasing power has still been lost. It looks like pretty sticky inflation, at least for the next year or two. So investors are asking, how can I protect my nest egg from being devalued? And average people with fewer assets are wondering how they can just keep their heads above water. The answer is basically the same for both kinds of people. You need to plan ahead. If you are renting, then you may want to lock in a longer term lease. If you are in a position to maybe purchase a home, it might be a great time to lock in a low interest rate mortgage, even though prices are kind of high. If your mortgage payment is about the same or only slightly higher than rent, it could sure make sense to buy, especially if you're committed to a certain area for at least, say, 5 years. Well, the last downturn was about 5 years. It went from about 2007 through 2011, 12, before the home prices really stabilized and it started to rise again. Regular homeowners and investors were much better off across most of America 8 or 10 years after the 2007 crash because of principal paydown and home price increases, not to mention the other tax benefits of home ownership and the peace of mind when you don't have to move because a landlord suddenly wants to sell or move back into the property or rent to a family member or just decides to raise the rent on you. All of my investor friends that had solid, lower end, cash flowing rentals simply didn't care that the sticker price of their asset went down during the '07 through 2010-11 crash because rent money just kept coming in all through the downturn and back up the other side. Most of us had to be a little flexible during the first 6 months of COVID, but rents were eventually all paid and equity is now higher than ever. The key is buying really good quality assets that have either no debt or cheap fixed debt, and then always having cash flow and a cushion. Let's talk about some other things. They say that the easiest way to make $1 million is to borrow $1 million and let someone else, like tenants, pay it back. I love that axiom because I'm a real estate investor mostly. But the easiest way to have made $1 million in the last 5 years would have been cryptocurrencies bought and sold at the perfect time. Well, if you're like me and you missed that opportunity, but you have a little discretionary income now, I think that some of the top cryptocurrencies have a definite long-term upside. But just like with real estate, you may need to have some diamond hands and long-term hodl ability to realize the eventual big win. The same thing will likely be true of buying gold and silver. A lot of people say, oh, it's the key, gold and silver, it's going up. Well, I think we're going to have some volatility over the next months to maybe a year or so, but over 3 or 5 or maybe even 10 years, there's likely to be a really big upside. Other smart things to do during inflation include buying a little extra of all the things that you know you will need. I've heard preppers say that in difficult times, 2 of something is 1, but 1 of something is really none. And as you know, we didn't only see toilet paper and canned food shortages during the early part of the pandemic. We've had ongoing problems with certain car parts and computer chips and some building materials. It's only smart to have a little extra of what you know you will need in the future. Now, I also tell people that watching a little less Netflix and Hulu and instead learning some gardening skills, first aid, and maybe some handyman and mechanical skills might really save your bacon if labor and supply shortages continue or get worse. Hey, just take a minute if you wouldn't mind and smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already. In summary, all indicators seem to point to continued inflation. Now, some people and the government insist that It's nothing to worry about. But I say, don't worry, but also don't hide under your covers and panic, all right? Be prepared and not scared. And I should rephrase that. Don't worry, but be concerned. It's just that you shouldn't be so worried to the point that you just are paralyzed. Again, learn a few more practical skills. Have a little extra food and supplies and a little cash. And if you do invest, invest wisely. And you should do just fine. Always remember, also, bonus item here, that strengthening relationships with family and friends and other people, even on communities like this, it's the best chance that you have to thrive and survive no matter what comes our way. Again, please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you on the next video.